Hi, everybody. So my name is Lane Castleman. I'm the managing partner of a company called Greenbrier. And I want to tell you a little bit about Greenbrier real quick, because we only have 15 minutes, and that's not a lot of time to talk about regulation, which is an incredibly dense and complicated subject. And I can't really see you guys, so at any point if you have questions, raise your hand, and if I don't call on you, just come up front, because it's pretty blinding. So I started Greenbrier about 2 years ago with another guy named Matt McKenna. Prior to that, I was the head of communications and public affairs at Uber, a small company based in San Francisco. Matt McKenna, he ran communications for President Clinton and the Clinton Foundation and the family for the better part of a decade. And we started Greenbrier to do two things specifically. One is crisis communications and management, which we're not going to talk about today. And the other is public affairs, which we are going to talk about today. So in the public affairs space, there's a little confusion about, is that the public policy space and how does that intersect with regulation? And the public affairs business is the practice of influencing people to make a decision or support a decision that you want. Whereas the public policy space is influencing that specific decision, right? So the difference is the people versus the actual materials or documents that are created that need to be changed. But because of that, that means we work a lot in the regulatory space in all different sectors. So of course, with my background, we do a lot in the ride-sharing space. But as you guess, one of the spaces that's probably most interesting and hot these days is the crypto space. And so we've had a lot of clients, some of the biggest in the country and certainly in the world, in all sort of manners of crypto and digital currency and certainly blockchain as clients. And so we work a lot on that stuff. And we're just as aware as you are with how schizophrenic the SEC seems to be and how weird regulations tend to come out of the three-letter government agencies on a regular basis. And really, if you want to know sort of the latest about what's going on in the crypto sort of regulatory or political space, there's a lot of good resources. My favorite is Marco Santori, who's an attorney out of New York and works at blockchain. I think it's msantori ESQ. Is his Twitter handle. He's got the latest and greatest. So I'm not going to talk about that today because that seems like kind of a waste of your time since you all probably know more about it than I do. So what I'm going to try and do is leave you with a couple of lessons about how you can run your business in your company as it relates to regulations, politics, government. Does that sound all right? See any nodding heads? Is that maybe useful? There's one smile. All right. So let's talk about the city of San Francisco. Anyone here from San Francisco? Okay, so a few folks. All right, so if you've spent any time there, you're aware of a couple of problems. We're going to talk about those problems real quick. And trust me, this is all going to come back to a point that deals directly with the stuff you work on a daily basis. So San Francisco has a really significant problem with homelessness, right? It's no secret to anybody that's been there. Actually seems like it's getting worse. I've been in the city for 20 plus years and it feels worse today than it has in years past. There's definitely a problem with property crime. So if you're from San Francisco or you've even been there as a tourist, you know if you leave your backpack on the front seat of your car, it won't be there when you get back. It's a pretty common problem. You've no doubt have heard that it's expensive to live in San Francisco. Affordable housing is the #1 issue that is on the minds of people that live there. I think the average cost is on this slide. What does that say? $3,300 for a median rent. It's a lot of money to run a place. And then the last one, of course, is traffic. Certainly in large part due to my former employer, traffic in San Francisco is really bad. So you would think with these issues that most people that live there are demanding change for these issues, right? Because if you live there, and some of you probably do, you walk outside of your apartment in the morning and there's somebody who's maybe homeless and you're trying to get to work and there's tons of traffic and you've had your car broken into 6 times in the past 2 years. So of course the city would be taking action to try and fix these issues. But in fact, here's what the city has done recently. The city has banned scooters temporarily. So Lime Bike, Bird, you can't use that stuff in San Francisco. The permit for that operation has been on the table for months, but you still can't operate. Sidewalk delivery robots, those sometimes they're really like small little devices that carry a sandwich. Other times they look like a refrigerator on wheels and they carry a bunch of sandwiches. Pretty strict regulations about those. And then of course, in the past couple of weeks, there's now talk about banning tech company cafeterias because they need you to go out on the street and buy food from the local restaurants, so you pay additional taxes that then go to the city. So city of San Francisco has also been waging war on Uber, Lyft, anything that has to do with ride sharing for years. So these are frankly kind of easy things to solve, right? Homelessness, pretty complicated. But San Francisco has been described as 49 square miles surrounded by reality. So San Francisco is a little unique. So maybe it's not the same in other places. So just up the road, Portland. Some of you maybe have been there. It's not a huge city. Portland has some similar problems. So for example, the drug epidemic in the city of Portland is pretty severe. And has been for a while and is only getting worse. Homelessness, again, not just a San Francisco problem, really bad in Portland. In fact, the numbers of people on the street in Portland is pretty close percentage-wise to San Francisco. And then, of course, transportation safety, right? And I don't know if it has to do with the weather or just the fact that the city, the way it's laid out, but there's a lot of pedestrian injuries in the city. So of course, same thing, people live there. Local government, can you do something about this, please? And what happens? No, we can't. So ride sharing has been fighting for its life in Portland since it first launched. Interestingly enough, the state spent years debating who is allowed to pump gas, right? Pretty ridiculous. I see a nodding head there. You probably have not been allowed to pump your own gas. And for some reason, I know this is like common on the East Coast, but not the West Coast, you still can't buy liquor anywhere else but at a state-sponsored liquor store, which oddly enough results in taxes going to the state. Okay, but so Portland, small, wacky city. There's a TV show about Portland called Portlandia. So maybe that makes sense. So how about Seattle? Seattle could be pretty normal. Again, same problems, right? I'm not going to go through each one of these because you can read it yourself, but traffic, homelessness, affordable housing, these problems are common all throughout the West Coast. Again, a local government that has an Amazon tax. Why not? It's only the biggest employer in the city. Might as well make it harder for them to do business there. Bike sharing has been fighting for its life. And then interestingly enough, the city of Seattle has decided to flout the National Labor Relations Board and is deciding to help unionize gig workers, even though that's basically illegal for a city to do. They're doing it anyway. So again, the hard problems haven't really been solved, but the easy ones have. So let's sort of talk about why that is. If you are a local government and you've been elected to a 2 to 4 year term, you have a very small amount of time to make an impact and hopefully get reelected. Places like San Francisco, there's term limits, so your window to get something done is pretty small. And you sort of move this up to the next level, to the state level. Let's say in California, there's also term limits in place. But there's a bigger bureaucracy to deal with, so getting laws passed takes more time and gets a little bit harder. And then you go to the federal government, and of course those folks don't have term limits, but getting anything done in Congress, regardless of your political affiliation, is difficult. It takes a long time to get anything changed and anything done. And so if something's really complicated, what's the incentive to create regulation? What's the incentive to put your reputation on the line? There's not really one. But yet if something is easy to fix, let's say you've received some complaints from neighbors about scooters on the sidewalks, constituents in your local community, it's pretty easy to put a ban in place. And so we know this first lesson, and this isn't news to any of you, I'm sure, which is regulators are slow to regulate things that are hard and are fast to regulate things that are easy, right? That all makes sense. It's basic elementary school. But how does that relate to our space, right? How does that relate to crypto? How does it relate to blockchain? I'm talking about local governments here, and clearly local government doesn't really have a lot of impact on federal regulations. So let's look at a couple of examples of what sort of happened recently when it comes to federal regulations. Anybody see the news out of Saudi Arabia last week? Anyone? Yeah, as it relates to crypto, right? So they reaffirmed that it's illegal to trade, right? And we know what happened with China last year, right? And there's probably, 13, 14 countries around the world where trading in crypto is illegal. Forget about an ICO. But you can't actually play in the space if you're going to do it in the country. And those countries have largely not benefited from one that we have in the US. And this is where the lesson comes into play. So in the US, we have a pretty big practice or industry of people made up and professions called lobbyists, right? So people whose job it is to influence regulators. You have people like me whose job it is to influence groups of people to decision. And we also have a government that, left to their own devices, generally does the easiest thing, but if they are pushed, they tend to be a little bit more thoughtful. So I could very easily see a federal government in the United States having been very aggressive with the crypto and digital space over the past 4 to 5 years. But something happened. We saw large companies, blockchain, capital B blockchain, the company, not lowercase blockchain, the technology, Coinbase, capital C, companies like that who hired people to go educate lawmakers, right? In fact, I mentioned Marco earlier. Marco was sort of the principal attorney at Cooley who was helping to create some of these regulations and now works at blockchain, but was on Capitol Hill trying to slow the initial reaction to the anger or angst that was potentially coming from some subsets of the government, initially law enforcement, right? Initially, we all heard crypto was for drug dealers, and now everybody realizes that isn't true. So what does that mean for you, right? Because you probably work at a company now, or maybe you are representing a VC or some type of angel investor who doesn't really have the interest or wherewithal or even size or scale to be hiring lobbyists to advocate on behalf of this industry when there's big players already doing it. So there's a couple of things that you can do. And this is sort of the lesson that I hope you take away from our quick conversation today. So the first one is you've undoubtedly read a bunch of stories about how Uber and Airbnb and companies that were founded 7+ years ago moved fast and broke things, right? They did the traditional ask for forgiveness. They just sort of did what they wanted to do, and the laws caught up with them. There's going to be a lot of books written about that. There probably already have been. That is an old way of thinking. So today, the most appropriate way to deal with regulators is the ask for permission model, right? Not ask for forgiveness. And let me sort of explain that. There's a bit more detail that goes to it. What I mean by that is regulators at every level don't know a lot about your space, right? Even though you're immersed in it, even though there's lots written about it, that's because there's beat reporters who pay attention to it on a regular basis. Most regulators are dealing with banning scooters, worried about homelessness, trying to fix whatever the issue du jour is in front of them on Capitol Hill. They're not really thinking about day-to-day cryptocurrency, blockchain technology type issues. So your ask for forgiveness strategy, ask for permission strategy is to educate. And in the US, our regulators tend to move offices pretty quickly. So a local elected official today is very likely going to be a state elected official in 2 years, maybe 3 years. And pretty soon after that, give them 5 or 6 years, going to be a federal official. It's the education that they get early that impacts the regulations that they end up passing later. So your job is to educate those folks that are close to you and are near to you, because they're not going anywhere, and likely neither are you. The second one that I think is more important, and is sort of the more controversial thing, if I say anything that's controversial today, is that we recommend, and we've seen companies successfully do this, for you all to self-regulate. So there are not a lot of regulations in the US around our space, around the digital currency space, and certainly around blockchain. So there's sort of two ways to look at that. One is you can have a business model that maybe thrives because there's a lack of regulation or there's a lack of clarity. Or you can have a business that looks at the well-worn path securities regulation has had for generations and take some of those rules and impose them upon yourself. Now, I'm not talking about the arcane rules that turn you into a publicly traded security. I'm talking about consumer protection. I'm talking about data protection. Some of the more common sense things that, when you really think about it, are not unreasonable types of regulations to have on yourself. And what we've seen is that we have a lot of companies that are in the ICO space that tend to get into trouble for one reason or another. And they really go down the line. The ones that have self-regulated and still gotten into trouble tend to get a slap on the wrist from the government. And the ones that have been exploiting some sort of loophole and are really just kind of trying to make money quickly are the ones that end up with serious legal and financial penalties. So those are my 2 recommendations for you. I think I'm just about out of time. I might have a minute or 2 for questions. And it's taken me 30+ years to become an expert in public affairs, so we couldn't cover it all in 15 minutes today, but I'm happy to talk more at a later time. I think my email is right here, so if you have questions on this stuff after today, give me a shout.
Perfect. Big round of applause.